That was more than Prince Darren's loyalist lords were prepared to suffer. Lord Onwin Peake and a somewhat reluctant Hobart Hightower summoned 11 other lords and landed knights to a secret council in the cellar of a Tumbleton inn, to discuss what might be done to curb the arrogance of the baseborn dragon riders. The plotters agreed that it would be a simple matter to dispose of White, who was drunk more often than not and had never shown any great prowess at arms. Hammer posed a greater danger, for of late he was surrounded day and night by lickspittles, camp followers, and sellswords eager for his favor. It would serve them little to kill White and leave Hammer alive, Lord Peake pointed out. Hardhue must needs die first. Long and loud were the arguments in the inn beneath the sign reading, "The Bloody Caltrops," as the lords discussed how this might best be accomplished. "Any man can be killed," declared Sir Hobart Hightower, "but what of the dragons?" Given the turmoil at King's Landing, Sir Tyler Norcross said, Tessarion alone should be enough to allow them to retake the Iron Throne. Lord Peake replied that victory would be a deal more certain with Vermithor and Silverwing. Mark Ambrose suggested that they take the city first, then dispose of White and Hammer after victory had been secured, but Richard Rawdon insisted such a course would be dishonorable. "We cannot ask these men to shed blood with us, then kill them." Bold John Roxton settled the dispute. "We kill the bastards now," he said. "Afterward, let the bravest of us claim their dragons and fly them into battle." No man in Thatcellar doubted that Roxton was speaking of himself. Though Prince Darren was not present at the council, the Caltrops, as the conspirators became known, were loath to proceed without his consent and blessing. Owen Fossoway, Lord of Cider Hall, was dispatched under cover of darkness to wake the prince and bring him to the cellar, that the plotters might inform him of their plans. Nor did the once gentle prince hesitate when Lord Onwin Peake presented him with warrants for the execution of Hardhue Hammer and Ulf White, but eagerly affixed his seal. Men may plot and plan and scheme, but they had best pray as well, for no plan made by man has ever withstood the whims of the gods above. 2 days later, on the very day the Caltrops planned to strike, Tumbleton woke in the black of night to screams and shouts. Outside the town walls, the camps were burning. Columns of armored knights were pouring in from north and west, wreaking slaughter. The clouds were raining arrows, and a dragon was swooping down upon them, terrible and fierce. Thus began the second battle of Tumbleton. The dragon was Seasmoke, his rider Sir Adam Valerion, determined to prove that not all bastards need be turncloaks. How better to do that than by retaking Tumbleton from the 2 betrayers, whose treason had stained him? Singers say Sir Adam had flown from King's Landing to the God's Eye, where he landed on the sacred Isle of Faces and took counsel with the Green Men. The scholar must confine himself to known fact, and what we know is that Sir Adam flew far and fast, descending on castles great and small whose lords were loyal to the Queen, to piece together an army. Many a battle and skirmish had already been fought in the lands watered by the Trident, and there was scarce a keep or village that had not paid its due in blood. But Adam Valerion was relentless and determined and glib of tongue, and the riverlords knew much and more of the horrors that had befallen Tumbleton. By the time Sir Adam was ready to descend on Tumbleton, he had near 4,000 men at his back. Benjicot Blackwood, the 12-year-old Lord of Raventry, had come forth, as had the widowed Sabbatha Frey, Lady of the Twins, with her father and brothers of House Vipron. Lords Stanton Piper, Joseph Smallwood, Derek Derry, and Lionel Deddings had scraped together fresh levies of greybeards and green boys, though all had suffered grievous losses in the autumn's battles. Hugo Vance, the young Lord of Wayfarer's Rest, had come, with 300 of his own men plus Black Trombo's Myrish sellswords. Most notably of all, House Tully had joined the war. Seasmoke's descent upon Riverrun had at last persuaded that reluctant warrior, Sir Elmo Tully, to call his banners for the Queen, in defiance of the wishes of his bedridden grandsire, Lord Grover. A dragon in one's courtyard does wonders to resolve one's doubts, Sir Elmo is reported to have said. The great host encamped about the walls of Tumbleton outnumbered the attackers, but they had been too long in one place. Their discipline had grown lax, drunkenness was endemic in the camp, Grand Maester Munkin says, and disease had taken root as well. The death of Lord Ormond Hightower had left them without a leader, and the lords who wished to command in his place were at odds with one another. So intent were they upon their own conflicts and rivalries that they had all but forgotten their true foes. Sir Adam's night attack took them completely unawares. Before the men of Prince Darren's army even knew they were in a battle, the enemy was amongst them, cutting them down as they staggered from their tents, as they were saddling their horses, struggling to don their armor, buckling their sword belts. Most devastating of all was the dragon. Seasmoke came swooping down again and yet again, breathing flame. 100 tents were soon afire, Even the splendid silken pavilions of Sir Hobart Hightower, Lord Onwin Peak, and Prince Darren himself. Nor was the town of Tumbleton reprieved. Those shops and homes and septs that had been spared the first time were engulfed in dragonflame. Darren Targaryen was in his tent asleep when the attack began. Ulf White was inside Tumbleton, sleeping off a night of drinking at an inn called the Body Badger that he had taken for his own. Hard Hugh Hammer was within the town walls as well, in bed with the widow of a knight slain during the first battle. All three dragons were outside the town, in fields beyond the encampments. Though attempts were made to wake Ulf White from his drunken slumber, he proved impossible to rouse. Infamously, he rolled under a table and snored through the entire battle. Hard Hugh Hammer was quicker to respond. Half-dressed, he rushed down the steps to the yard, calling for his hammer, his armor, and a horse, so he might ride out and mount Vermithor. His men rushed to obey, even as Seasmoke set the stables ablaze. But Lord John Roxton had claimed Lord Foodley's bedchamber along with Lord Foodley's wife, and was already in the yard. When he spied Hard Hugh, Roxton saw his chance, and said, "Lord Hammer, my condolences." Hammer turned, glowering. "For what?" he demanded. "You died in the battle," Bold John replied, drawing Orphan Maker and thrusting deep into Hammer's belly, before opening the bastard from groin to throat. A dozen of Hard Hugh's men came running in time to see him die. Even a Valyrian steel blade like Orphan Maker little avails a man when it is 1 against 10. Bold John Roxton slew 3 before he was slain in turn. It is said that he died when his foot slipped on a coil of Hugh Hammer's entrails, but perhaps that detail is too perfectly ironic to be true. 3 conflicting accounts exist as to the manner of death of Prince Darren Targaryen. The best known claims that the prince stumbled from his pavilion with his nightclothes afire, only to be cut down by the Myrish sellsword Black Trombo, who smashed his face in with a swing of his spiked Morningstar. This version was the one preferred by Black Trombo, who told it far and wide. The second version is more or less the same, save that the prince was killed with a sword, not a Morningstar, and his slayer was not Black Trombo, but some unknown man-at-arms who did not even realize whom he had killed. In the third alternative, the brave boy known as Darren the Daring did not even make it out at all, but died when his burning pavilion collapsed upon him. That is the version preferred by Munkin's true telling, and by us. In the sky above, Adam Valerion could see the battle turning into a rout below him. 2 of the 3 enemy dragon riders were dead, but he would have had no way of knowing that. He could doubtless see the enemy dragons, however. Unchained, they were kept beyond the town walls, free to fly and hunt as they would. Silverwing and Vermithor oft coiled about one another in the fields south of Tumbleton, whilst Tessarion slept and fed in Prince Darren's camp to the west of the town, not 100 yards from his pavilion. Dragons are creatures of fire and blood, and all 3 roused as the battle bloomed around them. A crossbowman let fly a bolt at Silverwing, we are told, and 20 mounted knights closed on Vermithor with sword and lance and axe, hoping to dispatch the beast whilst he was still half asleep and on the ground. They paid for that folly with their lives. Elsewhere on the field, Tessarion threw herself into the air, shrieking and spitting flame, and Adam Valerion turned Seasmoke to meet her. A dragon's scales are largely, though not entirely, impervious to flame. They protect the more vulnerable flesh and musculature beneath. As dragon ages, its scales thicken and grow harder, affording even more protection, even as its flames burn hotter and fiercer. Where the flames of a hatchling can set straw aflame, the flames of Balerion or Vagar in the fullness of their power could and did melt steel and stone. When 2 dragons meet in mortal combat, therefore, they will oft employ weapons other than their flame. Claws black as iron, long as swords, and sharp as razors, jaws so powerful they can crunch through even a knight's steel plate, tails like whips whose lashing blows have been known to smash wagons to splinters, break the spine of heavy destriers, and send men flying 50 feet in the air. The battle between Tessarion and Seasmoke was different. History calls the struggle between King Aegon II and his half-sister Rhaenyra the dance of the dragons, but only at Tumbleton did the dragons ever truly dance. Tessarion and Seasmoke were young dragons, nimbler in the air than their older kin. Time and time again, they rushed one another, only to have one or the other veer away at the last instant. Soaring like eagles, stooping like hawks, they circled, snapping and roaring, spitting fire, but never closing. Once, the Blue Queen vanished into a bank of cloud, only to reappear an instant later, diving on Seasmoke from behind to scorch his tail with a burst of cobalt flame. Meanwhile, Seasmoke rolled and banked and looped. One instant he would be below his foe, and suddenly he would twist in the sky and come around behind her. Higher and higher the 2 dragons flew, as hundreds watched from the roofs of Tumbleton. One such said afterward that the flight of Tessarion and Seasmoke seemed more mating dance than battle. Perhaps it was. The dance ended when Vermithor rose roaring into the sky. Almost 100 years old and as large as the two young dragons put together, the bronze dragon with the great tan wings was in a rage as he took flight, with blood smoking from a dozen wounds. Riderless, he knew not friend from foe, so he loosed his wrath on all, spitting flame to right and left, turning savagely on any man who dared to fling a spear in his direction. One knight tried to flee before him, only to have Vermithor snatch him up in his jaws, even as his horse galloped in. Lords Piper and Deadings, seated together atop a low rise, burned with their squires, servants, and sworn shields when the bronze fury chanced to take note of them. An instant later, Seasmoke fell upon him. Alone of the 4 dragons on the field that day, Seasmoke had a rider. Sir Adam Valerion had come to prove his loyalty by destroying the 2 betrayers and their dragons, and here was one beneath him, attacking the men who had joined him for this fight. He must have felt duty-bound to protect them, though surely he knew in his heart that his Seasmoke could not match the older dragon. This was no dance, but a fight to the death. Vermithor had been flying no more than 20 feet above the battle when Seasmoke slammed into him from above, driving him shrieking into the mud. Men and boys ran in terror or were crushed as the 2 dragons rolled and tore at one another. Tails snapped and wings beat at the air, but the beasts were so entangled that neither was able to break free. Benjicot Blackwood watched the struggle from atop his horse 50 yards away. Vermithor's size and weight were too much for Seasmoke to contend with, Lord Blackwood told Grand Maester Munkin many years later, and he would surely have torn the silver-grey dragon to pieces, if Tessarion had not fallen from the sky at that very moment to join the fight. Who can know the heart of a dragon? Was it simple bloodlust that drove the Blue Queen to attack? Did the she-dragon come to help one of the combatants? If so, which? Some will claim that the bond between a dragon and dragonrider runs so deep that the beast shares his master's loves and hates. But who was the ally here, and who the enemy? Does a riderless dragon know friend from foe? We shall never know the answers to those questions. All that history tells us is that 3 dragons fought amidst the mud and blood and smoke of Second Tumbleton. Seasmoke was first to die, when Vermithor locked his teeth into his neck and ripped his head off. Afterward the bronze dragon tried to take flight with his prize still in his jaws, but his tattered wings could not lift his weight. After a moment he collapsed and died. Tessarion, the Blue Queen, lasted until sunset. Thrice she tried to regain the sky, and thrice failed. By late afternoon she seemed to be in pain, so Lord Blackwood summoned his best archer, a longbowman known as Billy Burley, who took up a position 100 yards away, beyond the range of the dying dragon's fires, and sent 3 shafts into her eye as she lay helpless on the ground. By dusk, the fighting was done. Though the Riverlords lost less than 100 men, whilst cutting down more than 1,000 of the men from Aldtown and the Reach, Second Tumbleton could not be accounted a complete victory for the attackers, as they failed to take the town. Tumbleton's walls were still intact, and once the king's men had fallen back inside and closed their gates, the queen's forces had no way to make a breach, lacking both siege equipment and dragons. Even so, they wreaked great slaughter on their confused and disorganized foes, fired their tents, burned or captured almost all their wagons, fodder, and provisions, made off with 3/4 of their warhorses, slew their prince, and put an end to 2 of the king's dragons. At moonrise the Riverlords abandoned the field to the carrion crows, fading back into the hills. One of them, the boy Ben Blackwood, carried with him the broken body of Sir Adam Valerion, found dead, beside his dragon. His bones would rest at Raventry Hall for 8 years, but in 138 AC his brother, Alan, would have them returned. Todriff Markin entombed in Hull, the town of his birth. On his tomb is engraved a single word, loyal. Its ornate letters are supported by carvings of a seahorse and a mouse.